Hundreds, if not thousands, of cabin builds go unfinished every year. In fact, they get abandoned. When Darcy and I were first looking for property ourselves, one of the things I noticed was a lot of partially developed pieces of land, a lot of cabins that were started, cabins that were abandoned. When I decided to do this video, I looked it up. I tried to find a statistic on how many cabin builds were abandoned every year in the US. Honestly, I couldn't find one, but I've seen hundreds of them. And one of the things that always amazed me was how many of these cabin builds were simply abandoned. And I got to thinking about it. Why is that? Well, we're going to talk about that today. I think the first thing is that the allure of having a cabin in the woods, the solitude, the silence, listening to the trees, whatever it is you deem as that thing that you want. A cabin. Cabins have this nostalgic kind of thing about them. I know I wanted one for literally decades. And I'd lived in some. And I loved cabins. And I have to think sometimes, why is that? Why is it that we just love cabins? I don't know. But I'll tell you this. I think that some of it could be our love of Western culture. I mean, what's more Western than a cabin in the woods and a cowboy slinging a 6-gun with a lever action rifle over his shoulder or a double-barreled shotgun above the door? That's American West, right? And I think cabins are as much a part of American culture as, mom and apple pie. A cabin is this quintessential escape from the modern world. And we all, if you're watching this, you probably want one, or you have one, or you want to go stay in one, or just visit one. We love cabins. So why are so many cabin builds or homesteads or off-grid properties abandoned every single year? And believe me, it's a lot. No, I couldn't find a statistic to tell you exactly how many thousands there are, but I personally know of a lot of them. In fact, I personally know people that started cabin builds and then stopped and started and stopped and started and then finally moved on to something else. They just end up abandoning their hopes and their dreams. Well, why is that? Well, today I'm going to talk about why I think that is. I think many think of building a cabin in the woods as an easy thing, relatively inexpensive. It's fun, right? I think a lot of people, they think it's going to be fun. It's romanticized. And honestly, if you get on YouTube, there's lots and lots of channels out there where some guy builds a cabin in the woods and does it in a fairly short video, maybe 30 minutes long or an hour, maybe doesn't even talk. And those are fun to watch. I like watching those, actually. But I know what I'm looking at because I've done more than just build a cabin in the woods. I started my life as somebody that could frame, and I'm not going to call myself a framing carpenter, but I started that life after I got out of the Marine Corps. I always wanted to build something. I used to, in fact, when I was a kid, I used to take my allowance and babysitting money or whatever money I could get, and I would go and I would buy power tools, a skill saw, or a jigsaw, or a sander. All I wanted to do was build things. But it wasn't until after I got out of the Marine Corps, I went to work as a carpenter's helper on a condo show. And then from there, after the condos were completed and I'd learned a ton, I actually went into business doing renovations and making fences and actually even renovating old homes, really old homes. So I learned a thing or two over those years, but I won't tell you that I was a framing carpenter. I could do it. I knew what I was doing. I was able to read prints and even make my own prints, and I understood the basic principles of framing a home. But how many people actually know what that is? How many people actually can frame a home? I think a lot of cabin builders have no idea what it takes to frame a home. And I think some of the challenges that they face that cause them to fail or to give up or to quit or abandon their project are the very fact that building a cabin isn't actually easy. Yeah, anybody can go buy lumber at a big box store and then, get a trailer or a pickup truck and haul it out into the woods and start putting up a cabin, but they may not know about foundation types. They may not understand that you just can't build a cabin on the ground and expect it to last forever. That if you're going to set pier blocks, which is what I did, that they should be below the frost line. And if they're not, which mine are not, then you need to make sure that the ground you're putting them on isn't going to constantly frost heave and destroy your cabin over the years. Is it the right thing to do that I did? No, by the way, but that's another topic. It worked. But already I had an understanding of how to build a foundation. Now, for cabin building, it's important to actually understand foundations and frost heave and the frost line and how to build a strong foundation, one that doesn't move, one that's going to work for you, and then how to frame that cabin up. And I think a lot of people start these, that maybe they get a book, they watch some videos, and they go out into the woods and they discover that there's a lot to learn. I also think that a lot of times people either get the idea that it's inexpensive to build a cabin or that it's just cheap. I mean, you can just go buy whatever 2x4s you want and slap up some walls and throw a roof on top of them and you got a cabin. And honestly, if you watch a lot of the cabin builds on YouTube, they're not very well built. And I think that's okay as long as the people doing the build understand that what they're building is an inferior product. So for example, if you're going to build a cabin in a damp environment and you don't put vapor barrier in, either on the walls or on the roof, you're going to have a mold problem. The reason why you have vapor barrier is to prevent condensation from building up in your walls and creating mold, which will make you sick. So you gotta have a vapor barrier. You put in a vapor barrier because the inside of the cabin is going to be warmer than the outside at certain times of the year. And when you have a warmer interior of your cabin and a colder exterior, then the moisture is going to condense. The moisture inside the cabin will condense and it'll be on the wall, just like a tent. If you've ever gone camping in a tent and you know, in the morning you woke up and the walls of the tent were damp or wet and dripping, well, your cabin does the same thing. And if you don't protect it from that, you're going to have mold. Mold is bad. So when you watch these videos and you see a guy frame up a cabin, which can happen fairly quickly, and then slap some siding on the outside, and maybe even put insulation in it and then slap some interior paneling in, the first thing you should be thinking is, oops, that could become an abandoned cabin. Because perhaps 3 or 4 or 5 years later, you get sick because of the mold. So building a cabin in the woods it's a wonderful experience. I love the fact that I have a cabin in the woods and that I built it and I had friends and family that all helped me. And I'm still working on it because I enjoy that journey and I think you should. But I think one of the reasons for abandoned cabins is because people don't actually know how to properly frame and they run into problems due to the inferior framing that they use. For example, no vapor barrier or inferior roof trusses or rafters. I've seen cabins that were built with 2x4s for rafters on like a 512 pitch. Well, those are going to sag under snow load and eventually break and collapse. So that's number one. Number two, it's not inexpensive. The only inexpensive cabin builds that I know of are guys that are going out into the woods with a chainsaw and cutting trees down and making log cabins, and they're doing it all themselves. And that's something I could have done when I was 30, but I certainly couldn't do it today because that was almost 30 years ago. just about. And, you know, that could be fairly inexpensive. Fuel and a chainsaw and some chains and away you go. And you could do that. And a lot of trappers' cabins up in Alaska, that's how they're built. And then they put a tarp over some purlins and some roof boards and they throw some moss on top of it and they make a sod roof and away they go just like they did 200 years ago, minus the tarp. Otherwise, cabin builds are expensive. You need fuel, you need the tools, you need a generator of some sort. You've got to have nails and you've got to have the right nails. You can't just use brights. You might need galvanized in certain cases. You need a proper foundation and that might mean either pier blocks or concrete foundation or slab on grade, but that's all expensive. And it's also backbreaking work. And that's the other thing. Not only are cabins not inexpensive, and not only do they require that you understand how to frame, but it's physically demanding. So if you get out into the woods with this idealistic view that I'm gonna go build a cabin in the woods, it's gonna be fun, and you bust your butt for hours and hours and hours on end because it takes a lot of time. You've got to have a plan, which you can design your own plans or you can buy them. I bought a set from Country Plans, which has a forum that I'm actually in, and there's great people there that will help you out, though it's pretty quiet these days. But building a cabin is physically hard work. First of all, if you do it right, and you put in a foundation with concrete, either if you could do paver blocks like I did, but those are heavy. You got to dig, you got to get down a little bit anyway, at least a couple feet. In my case, I had a very, very well-drained location where the water really wasn't going to settle underneath the cabin in a very dry, arid environment. So there's not a lot of frost heave. 15 years, frost heave is very, very minimal at my cabin site. The water drains away perfectly, and I've really not had any significant amount of frost heave, but that's rare, folks. So if you're building a foundation, a wall type foundation with a framed floor or slab on grade, that's all a lot of work. Even if you can afford to pay a pumper truck to come in, it may not be that much work for you if someone else is doing it, but it's an expense. And it takes time. But once it's done and you start banging up walls, that's physically demanding work. You might only get one wall up in a day. If you've got a whole crew, you might be able to build more. But don't ever forget that a whole crew means a whole crew's worth of work. You can reduce the effort by having 10 guys help you, but it's still effort. And I think a lot of people believe or fantasize about building a cabin in the woods with their friends. But I will tell you, in the 15 years that I've been doing this, few friends are really willing to build your cabin for you. Lots of them would be willing to help you out, especially if they get to go and hang out with you at your cabin. But nobody really wants to build your cabin. They want to build their own, right? So never count on that. You are your own builder in that case. Unless you can afford to pay someone else to build your cabin, and then you're not watching this video anyway. If you're doing it yourself, it's a lot of work. And once you get the walls up, which, by the way, putting up a wall alone is pretty hard. Putting up a wall with 2 teenage sons is hard enough. When I built my walls, which were 24 feet long, we did 2 sections, one smaller, one larger, because it's hard to put up a wall, a 2x6 framed wall, by yourself, even with just a couple people. It's still hard to do, so it's physically demanding. Once you get the wall put up, you either have to put the sheeting on, or if you put it on already, then it's even harder to get the walls up. And then you got to start the roof, or the second floor, or the loft. And again, that's all hard work. So I think a lot of the challenge that people face is realizing, wow, this is hard work. And some people are afraid of heights. I knew a guy that was trying to build a cabin and doing it alone, and he started with a little shed and he abandoned it 2 or 3 times and eventually completely, because he would get up on the roof and then he would get scared. And he would do the work he wanted to do, but he would never finish it. Another thing that people tend not to realize, I think, when you're building a cabin in the woods that's a part-time thing for you, you're not full-time living there, is that rats and mice and bugs love your cabin. And they love to reside in your cabin when you're not there. In fact, they'll even reside in it when you are there if you let them. And I will tell you that back in around 2018, 2019, I got into a major rat battle. That's what I called it, the Battle of the Rats. Because I had failed to secure one of the roof caps all the way. And actually I have a video out that I put out about 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, where that roof cap had actually blown off and just exposed the vent at the top of the roof wide open. But that roof cap was kind of twisted a little bit, and well, the rats discovered that and they got in. And they started building homes in my walls and inside the cabin. And I ended up going out to the cabin, having to trash a bunch of stuff, completely clean out everything in the cabin, and then literally had to kill a rat or 2 inside the cabin and take some out that were dead because I put some poison in there. And then I had to put rabbit fencing, or often called hardware cloth, in the peak of the cabin to prevent them from getting in again. And I've even mentioned that in a couple of my videos. It's just something that you have to deal with. And in the wintertime, it's not uncommon for wasps to, well, wake up inside the cabin because we warmed it up above 70 degrees. So now you've got, it's a lot of work, it's expensive, and the rats and the bugs and the mice all want to move into your cabin when you're not there, or even when you are there sometimes. You need a place to go to the bathroom. People often go and build cabins in the woods and they think, well, I'll just do a cat hole or something, or I'll do like I did when I was camping. But guess what? The more you're there building, the more you need a place to use the bathroom. So you either have to put in an outhouse, or you could do what we did in the beginning, which we had something that the boys called the huggable, lovable loo. Huggable, lovable loo. It's called a luggable loo. They called it the huggable, lovable loo. And it was literally a 5-gallon bucket with a toilet seat on it inside of the old camper that we had. That was our bathroom. But we had to dig holes to put that in. And the longer you're there and the more holes you have to dig, the more you realize you can't do that forever. You can treat it and all that kind of stuff, but eventually you got to stop digging holes, and you need to dig one big hole and put in an outhouse, or you got to put in something else like a composting toilet. And one of the challenges that I think that people face that often end up abandoning their cabins is the permitting process. You may be in a county where maybe they don't require you to permit your cabin, or maybe they'll ignore it if you put one up without a permit. But a lot of counties won't do that. They'll insist that you do. In some counties, I have it on good authority, wink, wink, will actually tell you that you have to destroy your well if you put in a composting toilet and you don't put in a septic tank. In fact, they will tell you that you have to put in a septic tank if you're putting in a composting toilet. Or at least that's the way it was 15 years ago. And you've got to say, but wait, what? And then you'll find out that you can have an outhouse or a privy 150 feet from your well, and you don't have to destroy your well, but you will if you put a composting toilet in and no septic tank. So dealing with the county can be a challenge. Another one that's a small one is the whole heating your cabin thing. People don't really research stuff. Like, for example, wood stoves should have a cold air or fresh air intake for your cabin, because modern building techniques are based on a much tighter build. So an old cabin built 100 years ago is a really airy thing. And you don't need any air inlet for your wood stove, because guess what? It's drawing air from everywhere. Through the floor, through the attic, through the walls and the windows and everywhere else. It's not an issue. But you go frame a modern structure and you do it the modern way, it'll be very tight. 2x6 walls, some vapor barrier on the outside, maybe some craft faced insulation bats in the wall, nice tight paneling or drywall or whatever it is you want to use, and double paned windows and sealed doors and all that kind of stuff. It's super tight. Well, now you need to put in a fresh air intake for your stove, but people don't tell you that. So they don't tell you about the vapor barrier. Heck, I've seen cabin builds online where they get 1 million views, but there's no vapor barrier, there's no insulation. And that's fine, you could do that and not put any insulation in, but when it's 10 degrees below zero out, you probably wish you had some. So I think all of these kinds of challenges, not to mention distance. People often buy cabins that are a long ways away. I've mentioned before that our cabin's 4.5 hours from us. For me, not a big deal. That could be a big deal for me in 10 or 20 years, but today it's not. It's 4.5 hours. I can do that drive no problem, especially once I got a couple days to recoup afterwards. But at some point, physically, that could be a challenge for me as well. That could cause me to sell that place, maybe, although I don't think so. But I do think in a lot of cases, I've known people that started building cabins 9 hours from where they lived. And then they abandoned the build eventually, because guess what? Traveling 9 hours, you're not doing that every other weekend like I do here. You might for a little while, but eventually you're going to be like, nah, this is crazy. Or even every month. And the other thing is when you're building a cabin, you can't just like frame up some walls and walk away for 6 months. Well, you can, but when you get back, you may be reframing those walls. So cabin building also requires a commitment that most people don't realize they have to make. I constantly have this need, this gut feeling that I need to get back to my cabin. I've been gone for more than 2 weeks. I got to get back. Recently, I slipped a couple discs in my back. I mentioned that in my last video. And so I haven't been to the cabin in about a month. And I got to tell you, it's eating away at me, because I know that's not good. Oh, maybe I got rats living inside there. Kind of doubt it right now, because I've fought that battle a long time. I think I'm winning that one. But nonetheless, that is one of those challenges that I think kills a lot of these cabin builds. I think probably one of the most important things you can do if you're looking to build a cabin in the woods, outside of buying a piece of property within a decent range and having the wherewithal to do it, is to understand it's a long process. People are going to tell you they built a cabin in a weekend or in a week or two. But the reality is, if you're going to build a decent cabin, even just a 12 by 18 or 14 by 24 cabin still requires a fair a fair amount of effort and a process that will take you time. Even if you do it fairly quickly, say in 6 months to a year, that's still 6 months to a year's worth of time. You've got to be committed to it throughout that time. And then once you build that cabin, now you have to go back to it. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. You can't just leave your cabin in the woods for the next 3 years and then go back. There's a cabin near us. It's a beautiful log cabin. Looks like a kit that somebody put together and then didn't go in for 10 years or something like that. And when I went and looked at that cabin before it was sold to somebody else, it had a thick layer of wood rat poop all over the floor and urine on the walls, and everything was destroyed inside that cabin because it had sat for too long without the owner coming out and checking on it. They just assumed it would be okay, right? You got a nice cabin, you got it built, you close the doors and the windows and you walk away. But rats and mice find ways to get in, and so do spiders and ants and wasps and hornets and all those things. So you may build your cabin in the woods and come back a year later and find out you've got company. It's really important to have a realistic expectation, to be fully prepared, and to be fully on board, fully committed to get out there and repeatedly get out there and do the work that's needed to be done. And with that, I'd like to ask, what is your experience, if you have experience building a cabin? What kind of experience do you have building a cabin in the woods? And what kind of comments do you have? Do you agree with me? Is there something I missed? I'm sure there is. But videos have to be short. But if you've built a cabin in the woods and you've got some insights yourself, why not share them with the audience? Let them know what your thoughts are as well. I really do appreciate it. And check out some of my other videos. I'll drop another one right here for you to check out. I've got plenty on cabin building, sawmilling, and off-grid power. We'll talk to you again soon. Y'all have a great day. The old jarhead out.